Welcome Game Chasers everywhere to episode 35 of the Collecting Confidant with your host, GunstarHero. And I'm back with this new bi-weekly style of show structure, so thank you for being patient with the changes. But of course, it's going to give me a lot more time to examine other types of games in full detail, and thankfully it finally gave me a chance to go into a game I've been waiting to try for quite a while now. This one is an RPG that was just released a few months ago and is a remake of an old Japanese classic that never got outside of the East, finally is available to the West, and is courtesy of Square Enix. We're going to be talking about a game that's been on my to-do list for a while, and I'm so glad I finally got to experience it. This one is Live Alive, which came out on July 22nd, 2022, exclusively for the Nintendo Switch, and of course, is one of those new HD/2D remake style games that is getting very popular with Square Enix, which of course was started with Octopath Traveler. So, of course, if you're into the visual style of this, you're going to love Live Alive. And, of course, you'd also be familiar with Triangle Strategy. But Live Alive is actually a remake of an older game, and we're going to get into some of the history of that as we get through the video. But first, this game is something that is truly unique, diverse, and ahead of its time, especially the fact that it originally came out in 1994 for the Super Famicom and is doing so many incredible things in the JRPG genre that I feel that I just have to give it its justice. And first of all, if you notice the fact that I said Live Alive, there is an ongoing controversy over how to properly pronounce this name. Now, originally, when I saw this game, I wanted to call it Live Alive because it actually kind of makes sense with the overall theme of the game, but then I decided to kind of squash all that, go right to the source. I decided to watch the Nintendo Treehouse Let's Play of this, and they did actually say Live Alive, so I'm going to go with that pronunciation and stick with it. Okay, another thing I want to establish from the outset before we get into this game and what makes it so special is spoilers. Now, I grappled heavily with this concept because, A, this is my first time getting into like a full-fledged RPG for the purposes of a review. So I wanted to approach this game a bit differently because here's the thing. This game, Live Alive, is so full of so many wonderful surprises and plot twists that I'm trying to figure out how to really express how truly unique and groundbreaking this game is without spoiling too much. So I figure my philosophy is going to be that any of the details I share about story or plot or anything to do with the game is something already available in the promotional material, whether it's the written material or any of the individual trailers you can find on YouTube. So if you've watched any of this stuff in terms of previews, you're not going to learn that much more from what I'm talking about. So I feel like we're going to stay in a relatively spoiler-free zone and keep it that way. Okay, Live Alive, overview. This is a JRPG, of course, with a turn-based battle system that is broken down into several different non-connected stories. And what's really cool about this is that the first 7 of these stories and the 7 different characters that are related to these stories throughout space and time, all of these stories can be played in any order you want from the outset. And what I mean by that too, especially if you're thinking, okay, that kind of sounds like Mega Man. Is there a certain order that I'm supposed to play these stories to get maximal effect? No. I already checked that. The developer said that originally the intent was to say, okay, there might be a certain order to the stories, but they decided to scrap that to give the player ultimate freedom in how they wanted to traverse this overall grand narrative of little mini narratives. So what I will say is that, yes, you can do this in any order you want from the outset. I decided to start with the prehistory one and go from there. But again, it's not going to change your experience of the game depending on which character you decide to start with. Okay, that said, each of the different stories is so utterly unique in terms of mechanics, its tone, its feel, and its story. This is what makes the game truly exciting from chapter to chapter and gives you a breath of fresh air and keeps things exciting. But what I want to talk about first is the elements that unite the different stories in terms of its overall gameplay mechanics, its graphics, its sound, and overall feel. And then I want to split off into all of the individual narratives to really show you how diverse this game is and how breathtaking it is in terms of its innovation, attention to detail, and what it was trying to accomplish so long ago, and what it still gets right in terms of being utterly unique from other JRPGs, even to this day in 2022. Okay, let's talk about the game overall. Like I said, it's a JRPG with a turn-based battle system, and in most cases has your typical tropes of an overworld, dungeons, items, gear to add to your character to power them up, and all that fun stuff. So let's talk about the combat itself, which is kind of unique because it's done on a 7x7 grid system. And what it chooses to do is it gets rid of things like earning money after the battle and also using MP points, and rather during the battle itself, you can move anywhere you want. So typically in traditional old school 16-bit JRPGs, you'll either have the enemies on one side of the battlefield and you're on the other side. In this iteration, you're basically in the middle of the action and can move about freely. And what you have is not only do you have a hit point meter, but you also have a charge meter, and this serves a couple different functions. Not only does it show you where your turn is in relation to the rest of the battle, so you can kind of plan accordingly, especially in terms of seeing where your enemies are going in terms of their turns, but it also provides a method of determining how long it's going to take to charge your unique attacks. Some attacks may be instantaneous, or others are a little bit more devastating and may require a few turns to charge up. So this is going to affect the strategy of how you approach battles in terms of, okay, do I want to unleash this devastating attack knowing that an enemy could potentially interrupt it, and vice versa. So also, in terms of positioning, it's going to have a very big effect because the enemies have certain elemental weaknesses and also things that they are totally immune to. So, for example, an enemy may be immune to foot-based attacks, but totally susceptible to dark arts attacks. So, knowing that, you're going to have to position yourself on the battlefield in a certain way because all of your attacks have a certain grid-like pattern in terms of their effectiveness, and that can keep the battles effectively fresh and engaging from battle to battle. Also, what's really interesting about it is when you do get into party-based battles, you will, if you get overwhelmed, find your character in like this limbo situation where they have a halo around their head and they're not quite dead, but they're incapacitated. And this gives your allies a chance to revive you before you ultimately get thrown out of the battle and earn no XP points. Because what will happen is when you finally finish the battle, any surviving characters will level up, whereas those who have fallen in the battle obviously will not earn XP points. So you definitely want to keep a few healers on your squad to try to keep everybody in the fray, so that way you can level up everybody accordingly. Also, very cool, you'll be able to get gear and stuff like that. And there is a nice feature that the computer will allow you to provide a recommended gear assortment for each character, because there is a lot of stuff that ends up clogging up your inventory. I will give the game a minor critique for this. It can feel a little arduous to go through that, but that's a minor gripe. Overall, there's a lot of stuff you can do to outfit your characters and keep them very unique. In terms of leveling up, you'll get XP after every battle, and then as you level up, you'll be able to add more techniques to your arsenal to give you more advantages on the battlefield. So that's combat. Pretty much, like I said, there's overworlds in most scenarios, there's dungeons, there's NPC characters to interact with. For the first 7 chapters, in terms of combat, you'll be able to see all of the enemies that you're going to be fighting on the overworld. So you'll be able to dodge them, get around them if you don't want to fight. And then even if you don't want to fight, fleeing a battle isn't that hard to do and is sometimes required based on the situation you're in. Now, in terms of graphics, like I said, this has that HD 2D style that Square Enix is starting to use more and more for their retro style titles like Octopath Traveler and Triangle Strategy, and is truly breathtaking. I want to see more of this style. I want to see Square bring back more of its legacy titles, especially the ones that didn't reach North America, in this style, because I can't get enough of it. Because yes, it's retro, yes, it pays homage to pixel art, but even in levels like Edo Japan, the use of color and that symmetry between old school and new school is truly breathtaking, refreshing, and I highly recommend this visually. And even from a sound point, the composer, Yoko Shimomura, did an outstanding job in remaking her old compositions for this, and even brought on some star talent for some of the vocals, which we'll get into later, to truly give you like an insane auditory experience. So I'd say graphically, sound-wise, this is on point. point, if not superior to a lot of JRPGs, and you're gonna love it. So overall, this gives you an idea of the elements that tie these disparate stories together. Now, let's do a deeper dive into some of these specific stories as to give you an idea as to how this game reinvents itself from chapter to chapter. So of course, like I said, I did start with the prehistory chapter. This is centered around the character of Pogo, and the feel of this one is that this is kind of like a survival narrative where you have to protect the love of your life, Beru, from becoming the target of a human ritualistic sacrifice and survive the whole narrative. Now, what's interesting about this one is that there's no dialogue. So basically, all the communication is done through body language, grunts, and even little images inside of thought and speech bubbles, which can be kind of off-putting at first, and initially you may have trouble figuring out what to do, but once you overall get the flow of this chapter, you'll be able to navigate it pretty well. And what's cool is that there's a crafting element, so you can craft different weapons to help you in your combat, recruit allies, and have this party as you engage in battle. So I found this chapter to be very charming, a little simplistic, but overall very humorous with some scatological humor, and it was a good primer to get me into the game's systems that are similar from chapter to chapter. So that's the first chapter that's set in the prehistory period. The next chapter is going to be Imperial China. This is called the Successor Chapter, and this is where you take control of an old Shifu, a kung fu master who is now dying, and because he wants to keep his kung fu school legacy alive, he now has to recruit 3 disciples to find out who's going to become his successor and take over his school. The immediate thing you're going to notice about this is now we have full-on dialogue and full-on voiceovers, which I'm going to say is mighty impressive for this effort. I was really impressed with the level of the voice acting and the talent they brought on for this, so bravo for that to keep me engaged in the whole story. I found this story to be quite the fun romp and very reminiscent of old kung fu movies, and what's really cool about this is that now we're starting to introduce the replayability of this game, because there's multiple options in some of the chapters that can affect how the game is going to turn out. Specifically in this one, of your 3 disciples, whoever you decide to train the most is going to become the disciple that you're going to carry on through the rest of the game. So again, lending to the replayability and giving you multiple choices and options of how to play through this specific chapter. Moving on from there, then we have the Twilight of Edo Japan chapter, which I felt was one of the richest in terms of offering different playstyles, choices, and even secrets. So this one is more of a stealth chapter where Japan now is under disarray due to some ancient demon lord, and this ninja clan has sent you, Oboromaru, a lone shinobi, to infiltrate this castle and rescue a prisoner of war who is integral to the survival of Japan and its reconstitution. So, like I said, it's a stealth-based chapter where you now have this move where you can actually go invisible and avoid detection by the guards that are hunting you down. What's really cool about this chapter in terms of its replayability is how you choose to navigate it. You can choose to be a murderous, bloodthirsty psychopath and just careen your way through the chapter, taking out all the 100 different guards, or you can choose to go for the stealth-based, non-violent pacifist run, which I decided to do, which is a lot more difficult, a lot more involved. And I'm going to say this without spoiling too much. A word of advice: if you decide to do the pacifist run, make sure you're taking advantage of the fact that you can do multiple save files, because I lost about 4 hours of game time. I was near the end of the chapter and realized I had missed a couple of elements that would have allowed me to complete the pacifist run. I didn't realize it until it was too late. I had to go restart the whole chapter again. Thankfully, I had a secondary save file that allowed me to go back and do it properly. But I will say that that can happen. So make sure you are taking advantage of those files so you don't end up losing your head in the process. So that's the Japanese chapter of Twilight Edo Japan. Moving on from there, then you have a Wild West chapter starting a lone drifter who comes into a town to square off against his rival Mad Dog and gets caught up in this whole plot where these bandits known as the Crazy Bunch are threatening all these town inhabitants. So now you and Mad Dog, your rival, have to team up, help out the residents of this town, protect themselves against this oncoming ambush by the bandits. So what's interesting about this chapter is that there is very little combat until the end, and most of it is relationship building and helping figure out who these residents are and how you can help protect them and set traps against these bandits. I found this to be a thrilling chapter. A lot of people who review this game consider this to be one of their favorites, and I loved it too, especially the turn-based shootouts and the overall spaghetti western feel of this. I love this chapter, and it had a special place in my heart. Moving on, then we get into present day. So this is a very unique chapter and probably the shortest chapter in the game because this is strictly a fighting game. So in this one, you play as Masaru Takahara, who is a wrestling trained martial artist who wants to become the strongest man in the world. And this game is a straight up send up of Street Fighter 2 down to the character select screen, the pre and post game trash talking. And in this one, it's all battles. There's no overworld. There's no real dialogue. There's no dungeons. It's strictly battle to battle, just like a fighting game, but turn-based. And again, just keeping this game unique from chapter to chapter and keeping on your toes. But what's the coolest part about this chapter is that every time you engage a combatant and they try their moves out on you, you actually learn their moves and add it to your repertoire. So you can see how this can get very interesting and dynamic by the time you get to the end of the chapter. Keep going with this. We got a few more to cover. Next up, we've got the near future. I would say this is one of the most entertaining and most hilarious chapters of the game because it's a straight send-up of manga and anime of like the 80s and 90s. In this one, you play as Akira, an orphan youth who has mind-reading powers, and that's the main mechanic. So not only can you craft items for battle during this, but you can also read the minds of NPCs and get extra clues and story depth out of that. So I thought that was a really cool mechanic. But the best part of this, without spoiling too much, is that there is a subplot involving giant mechs, and they actually have this theme song for the Steel Titan called Go Go Steel Titan, which they actually decided to make into a full-fledged music video and was sung by Hironobu Kageyama, who's better known as the vocalist who did the opening theme to Dragon Ball Z. And not only does he sing this in Japanese, but then he actually uses his heavy English accent to sing it in English. And my God, I was on the floor rolling with laughter and delight. This is one not to be missed. All right, the final of the 7 selectable chapters is the distant future. I'm going to say this was my favorite chapter overall in terms of what it brought to science fiction JRPGs. This one is a very tight narrative aboard a single spaceship where you play as a robotic companion, ironically named Cube because you're a spherical robot, who gets in the middle of this horror mystery aboard a spaceship that was basically influenced directly by 2001 Space Odyssey and Aliens. So you can kind of see where this is going to go. And what's very interesting about this one is that there's virtually no combat until the final boss, but rather it's all dialogue, story heavy, and just really feeling the tension of a good old-fashioned space horror epic. You're gonna love this one, and there actually is some combat in it, but it's all done via an arcade machine. So I thought that was kind of a cool little touch, and just the mood and the atmosphere. I really want to see more games like this. So I love the inclusion of this. Really made me feel something in terms of like just terror, pathos, emotion. Highly recommend playing this chapter. So those are the 7 selectable chapters. And the next thing I'm going to tell you is what happens briefly after that. And I don't consider this a spoiler because this is in the promotional materials and on the cover of the box itself. There is an 8th unlockable chapter after you do the 7 chapters, which is set in the Middle Ages. Now in this one, this is a direct homage to the Final Fantasy series because of course the director of this game, Takashi Tokita, made his bones being the lead designer for Final Fantasy IV, otherwise known as Final Fantasy II in the United States for Super Nintendo. That was a project he did before doing his directorial debut on Live Alive. So you're going to see a lot of influences from that, specifically in the fact that instead of in previous chapters where in the overworld you'd be able to see the enemy you're about to encounter, now this goes for randomized hidden encounters. And briefly, the story is you play Erstead, who is this knight in the land of Lucretia who wins the hand of the king's daughter, Alethea, after winning this competition. But then Alethea gets kidnapped by the Lord of Dark. So then you, along with this posse, have to go and rescue the princess, and a whole bunch of twists and turns abound. So that's the unlockable chapter if you've completed the first 7. And then once you complete that 8th chapter in the Middle Ages, then you'll be able to access the final chapter, which I'm not going to spoil whatsoever for you. I will say that it is utterly brutal in difficulty, and unfortunately kind of hampers the pacing of the overall game, because the first 7 to 8 chapters are reasonable in terms of getting through it. Even if you're not totally familiar with JRPGs, you won't have too much of a problem. But when you get into that final chapter, this is where the game goes truly hardcore. And the only thing I'm going to say without spoiling anything whatsoever, I'm going to give you some tips. Number 1, again, make sure you have multiple save files, because if you mess something up, there are multiple endings in this game. And if you want to get the best ending, you're going to have to do things very specifically. And if you miss some stuff, you might screw yourself. So make sure you have multiple save files. Make sure you gather lots of healing items. And make sure you do all of the dungeons. That's all I'm going to say. Spoiler free. That's my tip to you and my gift to you. So that's Live Alive in a nutshell. You can tell I am just beaming over this game, even though it's not perfect. And hey, no great major piece of art is ever perfect. Hell, my favorite game, GunstarHero, is far from perfect. My second favorite game, Symphony of the Night, Castlevania, is not perfect, but they are still legendary experiences in their own right, just like Live Alive. Let's quickly talk about its history and development before we get into the retail copy. Very quickly, this game started life back in 1993 for the Super Famicom. It was, again, directed by Takashi Tokita after he had done the development work on Final Fantasy IV. And this game would go on to influence his later directorial work, specifically Chrono Trigger and Parasite Eve. Now, unfortunately, this game did okay in Japan, but because of some licensing issues, especially because Square had this partnership with Shogakukan Studio, which produced a bunch of mangas, there were problems with being able to localize this and release this to the West. So it remained confined in Japan for so many years. Several years later, eventually got a fan-made translation by Eon Genesis and was released to the internet, so people were able to download ROMs of it in an English translation. But then finally, in 2015, Nintendo did finally secure the rights, was able to localize it for the Wii U Virtual Console, and then in 2016 was also able to bring it over to the 3DS. So that was how our audiences were able to play it. But then finally, this year in February, Square Enix announced that they're going to be doing the full-on remake. And because the director, Tokita, was so inspired by what Square had done on Octopath Traveler, he wanted to take that same graphics engine and bring back Live Alive to modern audiences. And thank God he did, because this game, again, is a true gem. It's something that was truly ahead of its time. Does have its flaws, but honestly, just the complexity, diversity of the gameplay, and overall minute-to-minute surprises, it more than makes up for it. And of course, the beautiful graphical style and the incredible audio. Quickly, if you want to get this game, it is available from all major retailers for $49.99 US. You can get it now, anywhere you want. But of course, if you want to give it a shot before committing to purchasing it, you can actually download the demo from the eShop, and you can play the Edo Japan, Imperial China, and the Distant Future levels to give you an idea of whether this game is for you. I will say though, if you're not into JRPGs, or if you're unfamiliar with them, this could be a little much for you, especially in terms of how weird and quirky it is. But if you are a fan of JRPGs and are looking for a breath of fresh air, look no further. Live Alive is on the shortlist for my game of the year and possibly for all-time JRPGs. I love this game with all of its quirks, flaws, and holes. Highly recommend it. You've been listening to episode 35 of The Collecting Confidant with your host, GunstarHero, now into a bi-weekly format. We'll see you again in a couple weeks. In the meantime, make sure you like and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one. Later, Game Chasers, and peace.